Here's the thing about national parks. You either love them or you hate them. For many people, national parks become a bucket list, a way to see the most beautiful natural spaces in the country, spelled out in a line to check off during road trips and summer breaks. But for others, the prospect of a national park in their community feels like a betrayal of the land that they feel personal ownership over. They feel protective of their space and don't want other people ruining it. It's sort of a classic case of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, where people feel personally threatened by changes like a new land designation. Some don't want the regulations that would come with a designation like a national park, while others might be worried about the types of visitors that might show up, or overvisitation overall. Most national parks are located in rural communities, and the towns adjacent to national parks are affected by the hundreds of thousands or millions of visitors each year. There's so much potential for economic benefit for the communities surrounding these national parks, like having a thriving tourist economy, including restaurants that wouldn't necessarily be supported by only locals, outfitters and guiding companies, and of course, lodging. But there's also the heightened issue that many outdoor recreation economies face, like housing costs and the threat of too many visitors harming the environment that the national park was created to protect in the first place. You are listening to Getaway, a look into rural America's recreation economies. I'm Alana Newman, a reporter for the Daily Yonder. This podcast series will take us all over the country, from my home here in the Southwest to New Hampshire, West Virginia, Washington, Oregon, and Utah. We'll talk about what it means to be a recreation economy, how our rural communities are shifting, whether or not tourism and recreation are a boon for rural communities, the tourism housing crisis, how climate change could affect rural recreation economies, and how we access our public land. We'll talk to academics, community leaders, town employees, economists, recreationists, city officials, and so many other experts about what it means to create and exist as a sustainable rural recreation economy. Today we're going to West Virginia, to the newest national park in the national park system, River Gorge National Park. So Sarah Melotte is a reporter for the Daily Yonder, our data reporter, and she went to Fayetteville, West Virginia to look into what the New River Gorge, which is the newest national park in the country, and the communities around that have been experiencing since it was designated as a national park. Sarah, welcome to the show. And can you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your connection to outdoor recreation? What's your favorite way to be outside?
I live in the mountains in western North Carolina, and thankfully there's a lot of opportunities for getting on trails and through almost any season.
You visited the New River Gorge and Fayette County in October, and you talked with some of the locals in the area. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience visiting that region?
So I visited the New River Gorge National Park during basically what was the peak colors during fall. If you just type into Google like the New River Gorge Bridge, you're going to see the most beautiful pictures that come up first are like the fall colors, and it's just so picturesque and gorgeous. And Fayetteville, West Virginia, which is the county seat of Fayette County, is a small town of about 3,000 people at the north end of the New River Gorge National Park in southern West Virginia. It's one of several so-called gateway communities that surround the park. In Fayette, tourism seems to be a really big driver of economic activity. As soon as you're driving into town, there's a sign that says, "Welcome to Fayetteville, the coolest small town in America." And they're very proud of that. It's a cool area. There's lots of mom and pop shops around downtown. It's this little town just right in the middle of all these gorgeous mountains.
Can you give me a little bit of an overview of what the entire area looks like? What are the other towns that kind of surround the national park? What does the landscape look like? For someone who's never been there, set the scene for where we are.
The New River Gorge is the largest gorge in Appalachia, and so it's really deep. This river, the New River, which is kind of ironically named the New River because it's actually one of the oldest rivers in the world. It's over time, like the Grand Canyon has created this deep gorge that's created all of these really cool places to hike and look at the water and rock climb and raft. And yeah, I hope that paints the scene a little bit.
Yes, totally. So the area and especially the main economy of the area has changed a lot over the past decades, as many recreation gateway communities have. What did you hear about how Fayetteville and the surrounding area has evolved over time?
Yeah, the economy of West Virginia has really changed over the last several decades. So, in the late 20th century, the New River was a huge driver of tourism for people mostly interested in rafting, kayaking, whitewater canoeing, those types of activities. Two climbers that I spoke to, Mara and her husband Gene, who moved to Fayette County in the early 1990s, they told me that around that time period is when climbing started to grow in popularity as one of the major drivers of outdoor activity. And now climbing, coupled with the new national park designation, is driving a lot of tourism. But before that, Fayette County and the surrounding counties of Raleigh and I believe Greenbrier also sits on this huge coal seam. People think of West Virginia, I think they often think of coal mining. So that was, in combination with timber extraction, a major driver of economic activity for a long time. But it's been leaning a little bit more towards tourism, but we can get into some of that economic stuff later. But one more piece of background information I think is important is that the New River National Park was designated as a national park officially in December of 2020, but it's been public land since the 1970s. So in 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed legislation establishing the new River Gorge National River, which is a conservation area for natural, scenic, and historic values. So it's been a special place for West Virginians and for those in the surrounding areas for a long time. And now I think it's getting even more recognition because of the national park designation.
When we were coming in the 80s, town was boarded up. The coal boom was over. There was not a restaurant in town. There was Ben Franklin. There was Little General, and that was about it as far as businesses.
That's Maura Kistler, one of the founders of Waterstone Outdoors, the gear shop in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and her husband, Gene.
I'm Maura Kistler. I am 66 years old. We moved here in 91 from Virginia, and we'll never leave.
My name is Gene Kistler. I'm 68 years old. We started climbing here in probably 1983 or 1984.
Sarah, you talked to Gene and Maura about the changing economy in Fayetteville and the area surrounding the new River Gorge National Park. West Virginia's economy has historically been tied to extraction with coal mining and timber, but now the economy is shifting more towards tourism with 1.7 million visitors to the new national park in 2023. What did you learn about how the region has changed over the past few decades that Maura and Gene have been business owners in the area?
Like you said, tourism is bringing in lots of money, not just in the national park, but there's lots of climbing and hiking right outside the national park as well on state lands, county and state parks as well. And so now there are more people employed in tourism than there are in the mining industry, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when it comes to state revenue, however, mining is still bringing in more money, but it seems like year after year, tourism is bringing in an increasing amount of money to the state. The total economic impact of tourism was about $9 billion in 2023. It's an increase of about 6% since 2022. Those numbers have really started to skyrocket since COVID, but really they've been increasing for a while. They're just experiencing more growth now. I think that people have discovered the national park because they wanted to get out of cities and experience the outdoors during COVID, where they felt like there wasn't a lot of other activities to do, that especially that first summer. And so a lot of rural recreation areas have experienced increased tourism and visitorship numbers. You know, I think that part of that, the continued increase in tourism is maybe in part due to the fact that people can work remotely now, and so there's There's increased people who are working from home, who have the flexibility to go make a weekend trip to a national park or to discover new national parks or discover new areas that they haven't been before. That's part of what's driving increasing numbers here as well. And just to illustrate that point more, I'll give you some other figures here. So tourism generated about $887 million additional dollars in tax revenue. There is an 17% increase in tourism spending compared to before the pandemic. And if you compare that to overall in the US in general only experienced 1% increase. And so, West Virginia, this is all of West Virginia, not just Fayette County. But yeah, West Virginia is raking in the tourism bucks.
When we moved here, everyone had stickers. You're either friends of coal or friends of tourism.
Maura and Jean have really seen the area shift towards tourism since they've lived in the area. And West Virginia really has a push towards outdoor recreation development and tourism development right now, which is why it's such an interesting place to look at, especially for a place that has this history of mining, extraction, and as a state kind of figuring out how to move away from that and towards this different focus. Whether or not it's better for communities, that's something that remains to be seen, that we're exploring in this podcast, because, well, many people think that recreation and tourism is a fix, and it's really been pushed by a lot of academics and economists, that whether tourism and recreation can also be extractive in kind of its own ways.
Right. And I think I want to touch on that a little bit, actually, because I think that's a really important point, that it can feel like much needed economic activity. But I think if the tourism industry is not managed well, especially for small towns, it can really wreak havoc on the local community. In a place like Fayette, despite all the great statistics that I just cited on tourism, like a lot of rural communities that used to rely on coal mining, the poverty rate is still quite high. So despite all of these changes and increases in tourism dollars, it really hasn't brought the region out of high poverty rates. 20% of Fayette County residents live below poverty, compared to about 16% of the total rural population. And about 7% of those people are extremely low income, which is like less than $10,000 a year in household income. And so there are still a lot of economic hardships in this area. A lot of it has to do with the history of natural resource extraction and exploitation of poor people in the area. So tourism is not a band-aid that fixes everything. I think that there's a lot of potential there, but it needs to be managed well.
Yeah, and I think a big piece of that, and there is a lot of nuance to this too, is that tourism and recreation has a lot of minimum wage jobs. Tourism includes restaurants, it includes retail, guiding jobs. These are all fairly low paying jobs that oftentimes make good tips, but are not actually paying those wages that support a family, especially with rising cost of living. But that kind of is this interesting dichotomy where, when you're thinking about a recreation economy, how do you find those higher paying jobs that people associate with mining, with manufacturing? It's this really challenging economic situation that a lot of small towns are dealing with, especially when they're thinking about or planning for developing their recreation economy. So this is kind of across the board, that's something that I'm seeing in my conversations with people around the country when they're thinking about whether they want more tourism and recreation. How do they balance that out? How do you find those high paying jobs that go along with those service industry jobs? Because recreation and tourism generates a lot of tax dollars, but it's not necessarily paying people those high paying, it's not a high paying job. The pandemic was a really big shift in growth for recreation communities across the country. In this area specifically, that time period kind of compounded with the national park designation, and there was just a huge influx of new visitors for this area. How did this affect the communities?
Like you said, it's kind of hard to decouple COVID from the national park designation because they happened around the same time and they both caused increases in visitors. But, I've looked at this topic at a national level as well. After COVID, rural areas dependent on recreation grew at a faster rate than the rest of rural America, and people wanted to recreate in rural areas with beautiful outdoor amenities. So a lot of people migrated from cities to rural areas, if not permanently, then temporarily or just for vacation. And so lots of places experienced increasing traffic, both in vehicles and foot traffic on trails. That was something that people talked about a lot too during COVID, was hikers being able to find a place to park at some of the trailheads, or climbers getting to a spot and it's already totally populated by lots of other people. I think the general feeling was just like some of these places were being loved a lot. The sources that I talked to said that they really noticed increases in visitor numbers because of the national park, and people were coming from all over instead of just neighboring counties and states. Lots of not just climbers and rafters, but people interested in visiting every single national park too, like people who were just interested in the phenomenon of American national parks and wanting to get their stickers and visit all the places. And so there were, new types of visitors as well.
Here's Jean Kissler talking about how they've seen the types of visitors change since the redesignation.
Just over the last 5 years since the pandemic, the redesignation of the park from a national river to a national park, a few words made this huge difference in terms of visitation and people suddenly going, well, there's a park. I want to be over there. It's the same place it was the day before. Yeah.
It was kind of hard to separate COVID from the redesignation because, numbers went up. People rediscovered the outdoors, I guess, during COVID. And that was one byproduct of COVID that was probably a good thing. I mean, there's very little about COVID that was good, but that was one thing. And so, our numbers probably went up from that. But the redesignation, too, traditionally over a 5-year period, when a park is redesignated, there's about a 20% increase. It levels out at about 20%.
That's Eve West, the Chief of Interpretation and Education for the new River Gorge National Park. Another piece of that growth since COVID that's really hard to decouple from the pandemic is what's happening with our population shifts. Housing costs are a huge part of that. And that kind of comes from this idea that if people want to live somewhere, then the housing costs go up, which drives people away who can't afford to live in a place that they've always lived. Sarah, I know that you looked at some of the numbers around housing in Fayette County and the surrounding area. Tell me what you found for this region specifically.
When I was talking to people about what the housing situation was like, it was a question I specifically asked everyone, because it's something that's been on my mind when I've been doing some reporting on rural recreation counties for a while, and so usually what you see is increase in housing demand and prices because it's a desirable place to live. And so a lot of people were kind of alluding to that in-migration was causing a resulting strain on the housing market in the local area. And so a lot of times when I'm doing other stories, I'll interview a source and they'll tell me something, and then I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I'll go look at that later and go find the data that backs that up. And usually it does. And I don't think that these people are trying to make anything up. There was in-migration. But the interesting part about it was that the in-migration did not outweigh the out-migration. So there was actually more people that left than came in, but the housing costs still increased. So it's just an interesting dynamic because lots of other rural recreation areas gained population compared to the rest of rural America. They gained more population and have been increasing at a faster rate, but Fayette County doesn't fit that mold as much. So going back to housing prices, the median home value in Fayette in 2023 was $119,000, up from just over $100,000 in 2018. Housing prices did increase, and then there is something interesting about it's called the housing price index, which is just kind of lets you track the overall cost of housing, rental, owned housing, like total overall cost for everybody over time. And so there's this chart from the St. Louis Fed that shows, okay, increasing housing costs in Fayette County. And so since the 1990s, it's like slowly meandering up, and all of this is adjusted for inflation. But once you get to 2020, it like really shoots up dramatically. And so people are right that, yeah, there are new people coming in to Fayette County and housing prices are increasing. But it's a complex process because the same thing happened to the housing prices nationwide, as I'm sure everyone knows. So I don't want to single out Fayette as a specific example. It's just, I guess, hard to attribute it all to tourism because there were all of these things happening in the national housing market at the same time, inflation, increasing costs of construction, and how much is tourism driven, how much is the national housing market. That's kind of hard to kind of parse out. But the general feeling among the residents, the people that I talked to, was that tourism is part of this slightly increasing cost of living, and it doesn't seem to be in the crisis stage like you're probably gonna look at in other counties, places like Eagle County, Colorado, or like Moab that you've looked at. But I think it's something that is on people's minds about not wanting this to get out of hand, wanting to steward this economic activity well so that there is not a future housing crisis, so that the people who work in the county can afford to live in the county. It's definitely something that's on people's mind, even though it's not a full-blown crisis, or doesn't seem to be yet.
That's really interesting that the area has kind of gained the same amount of people as it's lost. Can you tell me anything more about who is moving to the area, who's leaving the area? Do you know why any of those things are happening?
I think this is one way that Fayette County kind of stands apart from some other very more expensive, more in high demand rural recreation areas, is that it's not exhibiting something that I've witnessed called displacement, which is when higher income people are replacing lower income people in an area. It doesn't seem like that's happening. Like the gross income of the people that are leaving is not lower than the people who are coming in. So it's not gentrifying in that way quite yet, but that's a trend that you would see in other rural recreations areas for sure. But each place is different. Rural America is not a monolith, and other like tourism areas are not all the same. So it's interesting just kind of, compare it to national trends.
Here's Matt Carpenter, president of the New River Alliance of Climbers, on how the local community feels about the national park designation and its effect on the community.
Some people are upset that housing prices are going up. Some people are upset that, there's traffic when there didn't used to be. Some people are, upset to see their quote unquote secret areas discovered. But, other people are happy that their businesses are getting more revenue flowing through, and people are happy to see more restaurants opening to choose from, and things like music and nightlife and entertainment. A lot of folks are happy to see that, and sometimes it's the same people.
In the New River Gorge, one thing that community members worried about was a loss of hunting land. Here's Eve, who works with the park, again.
As it worked out, only about there was 90% of the park that was maintained as preserve. So you can still hunt in 90% of the park, and 10% of the national park and preserve is national park. So there's 10% of it that's off limits to hunting.
In 2021, Brad and Alice Smith started a program called Ascend West Virginia through their Outdoor Economic Development Collaborative, or OEDC, that incentivizes moving to West Virginia through $12,000 stipends for people interested in moving to certain rural areas. The New River Gorge is one of them. Gene says that he's seen a lot of great people moving to the area through the program.
It's amazing how many climbers have been accepted in the Ascend program. And Sunday we're having a potluck cookout with all the Ascenders. There are about 30 folks here now. That has really brought focus on this idea of people being intentional.
Rural communities are often seen as places that people leave. Kids grow up, go to college, and get out. This creates a stereotype of rural communities as shrinking places. And for economic growth, there needs to be new ideas, whether that's from people who already live in an area or from people moving there. Ascend West Virginia is bringing people to the New River Gorge and other small towns around West Virginia who want to move to those areas and are invested in staying, at least until the end of their contracted 2 years. The Ascend program is a really unique way to bring more people to West Virginia's small towns and support the outdoor recreation economy that is currently growing in the region. But there's also a need for integrated planning within municipalities and states to help support the burgeoning economy. Here's Jean again.
West Virginia is trying to learn a new trick, you know.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's sort of in play is that, you know, for over 100 years, all the support service work for the coal and extractive industries, all these accountants and attorneys and all this, and they're all trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do? How does this new economic direction affect me? And so there's a lot of foot dragging.
In our last episode, Eric Ewert, a geography professor from Weber State University, talked about how Utah's Mighty 5 campaign contributed to compounding growth in visitation to Utah's 5 national parks: Canyonlands, Arches, Capitol Reef, Zion, and Bryce Canyon. Eric really stresses that coordinated planning is the key for avoiding some of the overvisitation that Utah's national parks are dealing with currently.
It's very important to involve the community in that planning and their vision. Too often, either decisions are made at the state level or the county level or the national level, and particularly at the corporate level, that say, okay, we're going to put in a 100-room hotel, or we're going to open a guide service or a bunch of restaurants or whatever. And the local community is largely left out of that planning process. Somebody benefited. They sold the land or they got the contract to build the hotel. But you really need buy-in in that community. They need to be involved in the planning. They have to be able to articulate their vision of what they want it to look like, what they'd like their kids to grow up in and hopefully stay in town and live in.
I asked Eric if there was anywhere specific that he sees doing this well.
It's so often now happening a little bit after the fact that, oh, we're suddenly growing. We better have a master plan. We better have a general plan. We better have a green space protection program. We better figure out what we're going to do with water and garbage and parking and traffic and all that. So it's kind of an American thing. We're not very proactive. We tend to be very reactive. Think of climate change. So there's a lot of good planning going on now, but it would have been a lot easier a lot earlier. There are towns that are on the cusp of being discovered. And if they could do some of the base level groundwork planning now, they would be so much happier in 5 years or 10 years or 25 years. Most larger counties now, and certainly municipalities, and certainly federal land use managers, BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, really get the planning idea and how key it is. And so they're much better about that. But the recreation has grown so rapidly that even those plans become outdated quickly and overwhelmed. So you build a new trail, a new boat ramp, a new parking area, a new campground, and it's already full because the demand's so great. We've committed to this growth economy in tourism, recreation, outdoor recreation, and retirement. But the infrastructure, the workforce, the planning is not keeping up with it. And that's just not sustainable. It's only going to lead to bigger problems. And that's worrisome. It's worrisome for the people that have to deal with it directly. Their quality of life, their cost of living, their job satisfaction. It's the great downside to growth.
Are there any good solutions to this challenge around continued growth?
Stop advertising. And that's really a big one, is we don't really need to promote anymore. The marketing worked. Now we've got to focus on management and mitigation. That's the antithesis of what a typical Utah politician would advocate. We've got to stop promoting and start planning. Stop marketing and start mitigating and managing. My favorite one is most of the tourism promotion for Lake Powell shows the lake 30 years ago, not a 2/3 empty bathtub ringed mud flat surrounded reservoir. Because tourists don't want to see that. So some of the advertising isn't even accurate. It's false advertising, which you would think eventually tourists would show up and be pretty disappointed. Wait a minute, this is not what I bought a plane ticket for.
As Eric mentions, our national parks have plenty of advertising, basically just because of the name, National Park. Jean and Maura talked about this as well. Once the new River Gorge was redesignated from a national river to a national park, all of these visitors who never would have come otherwise started flocking to the area. National park visitors are a different sort of tourists than those that are attracted to other types of public land like BLM or Forest Service. But Fayetteville and the communities surrounding the New River Gorge are still early on in the process. They aren't overrun by tourists the way that some of these other national park communities are. They aren't in the middle of a housing crisis. Locals aren't being pushed out by second homeowners. These communities still have the opportunity to work on that mitigation piece and plan ahead for more growth in the direction that the community wants. Fayetteville is thinking about all of these things and hopefully will continue to work towards sustainable recreation for the New River Gorge National Park and the surrounding communities. But even the biggest national parks and most popular public lands are facing threats to tourism and visitation because of our changing climate. I spent a summer working in Glacier National Park in northwest Montana, and I saw this happening right in front of my eyes. In other parts of the country, like my home in the Southwest, the Colorado River Basin is incredibly overallocated, and a place like Lake Powell, like Eric mentioned, that's still a popular tourist destination for boating, doesn't look anything like it does in advertisements. And because of the drought, it never will again. In our next episode of Getaway, we're going to be talking more about how climate change is affecting our rural recreation economies with lower snow years, drought, and warmer temperatures, as well as how rural communities are especially vulnerable to wildfires, flooding, and other natural disasters heightened by climate change. That's next time on Getaway. I'm Ilana Newman. You've been listening to Getaway on the Rural Remix podcast feed. This episode was produced and edited by me, Ilana Newman. Julia Tilton is our associate producer, and our executive producer is Joel Cohen. Original music by Quincy Ponver and Leo Posel. Reporting for this series was made possible in part with support from the Lore Foundation. Lore works with people in the rural Mountain West to improve quality of life. Rural Remix is a production of the Center for Rural Strategies, and we would like to thank the staff of the Daily Yonder and the Rural Assembly.